Hello everybody and welcome to another top 10 video. Today we're gonna be once again talking about Star Wars movies, and today we're gonna be talking specifically about my top 10 Star Wars movies ever. Now some of you out there watching this might be thinking, but there's only 7 or 8 I guess Star Wars movies, how can you make a top 10? Well, there's 2 other ones that I put in here that aren't really counted as Star Wars movies, but they are still Star Wars movies, if that makes sense. You'll see what I mean when I get to them. But they are still Star Wars movies that just aren't really recognized as much as the main films. So I'm going to be including those in here, as well as episodes 1 through 7 and Rogue One. So you'll be getting my thoughts on pretty much every Star Wars movie that has been released. So with all that out of the way, let's get on to number 10, which is unsurprisingly the Holiday Special. Now I'm not really completely sure what to say about the Holiday Special, because first of all, if you're a Star Wars fan and you know anything about the Holiday Special, you probably already know how terrible it is, even if you haven't watched it. Also, I can sort of be entertained by it in a way, because while there is little entertainment value in the sense that it's entertaining in the way it should be, it's still really fun to watch and just make fun of. I think that's a very strange thing for really any movie, to have no entertainment value as it's meant to have, but to have a lot of entertainment value in the way that they don't want it to have entertainment value. So I would say watch this either if you're with some friends and you just want to make fun of something and just have a fun time, or watch it if you're just like me and you're like, I love Star Wars, I'm devoted to Star Wars, I want to watch this just so I can experience everything that Star Wars has to offer, even if it's really terrible, and just kind of accept that they really goofed on this one. And then either one of those situations it's fine, but other than that, just steer clear of this one. It's really not worth it unless you fit into one of those 2 categories. So unsurprisingly, the Holiday Special is at the very bottom of the list. Number 9 on the list is Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Now, Attack of the Clones is really the only Star Wars movie that I found myself being completely bored in. Even the Holiday Special managed to get more enjoyment out of me than Attack of the Clones did, and I'm only putting this ahead of the Holiday Special just because the quality of the film itself is better, and if it wasn't, then this would definitely be last. I do enjoy parts of this movie. I think that the clones are cool, and I like the part on Kamino. I think that's all cool and whatnot. Obi-Wan is pretty interesting. His story through this with the clones and everything is interesting. But really, there's nothing that interesting in this movie besides that. The music's still good, although it is probably the weakest Star Wars soundtrack for the weakest Star Wars film, which is very unfortunate. Yeah, it's just not that good. There's not much good content in the movie, and it pretty much bored me from the minute I started it to the minute I ended it. Like I said, there were a couple of interesting parts, but for the most part it was just not very enjoyable. And I hate to say it, because yes, it's Star Wars and I want to love it, but unfortunately Attack of the Clones is the worst main Star Wars film in my opinion. Now, number 8 is the Clone Wars animated film. I actually haven't seen the Clone Wars in quite some time, so maybe if I rewatched it my opinion would change a bit. I'm just going off what I remember of it. I thought everything looked good. Being an animated movie, it actually looked kind of decent. The animation was okay and everything looked good, and that's something I really pay attention to, because myself, I'm a 3D artist and an animator, so I like to sort of look more at that part of it. That's pretty decent. The voice acting is alright. The story is really not all that great. The music's alright. The music, again, Star Wars usually has pretty good music no matter what. Even at its worst, like in Attack of the Clones, there's still some good stuff in there. Those few things are good, but other than that, it's just not really that entertaining. It's kind of boring. Thankfully, the TV show is better, which I haven't actually watched all of, but what I have seen is better than the TV show. I think this is probably the most forgettable Star Wars movie. Even though Attack of the Clones is worse, it still has some memorable lines in it, such as "I don't like sand" and things such as that, whereas this just kinda doesn't have much to it that's memorable, other than like maybe a scene or two that was kinda cool. So, unfortunately, The Clone Wars sits at number 8. And at number 7, we have a movie that many people would probably place lower on this list, but I didn't, obviously, and that is The Phantom Menace. Now, this actually used to be my favorite Star Wars movie when I was, like, much younger, like 10 years ago. And then I realized that it's actually one of the worst, and all of that sort of thing. As I got older, I looked more at it, looking less at the explosions and the effects and more at the story, the characters, acting, all of that sort of thing, and it's not really that good. Some of it is interesting. I was surprised at how much I actually liked watching this movie when I watched it again. The plot was sort of interesting. It wasn't great, but it was definitely more interesting than Attack of the Clones. Darth Maul is a pretty cool villain. I really hope we get to see more of him in like a spin-off about him or something. The lightsaber battle at the end was pretty entertaining, and the pod race was pretty entertaining as well. And as always, the music is very good, especially the Duel of the Fates. But unfortunately, besides that, there's not a whole lot of good about The Phantom Menace. Again, some of the acting really isn't that good, although in my opinion not as bad as Attack of the Clones, but still far from perfect. And also, a bunch of people have already talked about the overuse of CGI, and while not all of it looks terrible, there is some of it that does stick out, especially in the scene, the underwater scene when they're in the Gungan city, when pretty much the only thing that was actually on the set was like the actors and maybe the floor, and everything else was CGI, and it stuck out like a sore thumb. So, unfortunately, once again, Phantom Menace sits at number 7, what many people would consider to be the worst Star Wars movie, but I can find some good stuff in there. But either way, it sits at number 7. Next up at number 6, we have a movie that some people will definitely disagree with me on, but number 6 is actually Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, oh, it's one of the originals, how can you say it's number 6, it should clearly be in like the top 3 or 4. Well, honestly, as much as people praise like the beginning of the movie, I was bored for the first half of the movie or so. Like, the part on Tatooine is okay, but I didn't get much entertainment out of it. And then also the pretty much everything that happened on Endor leading up to the Battle of Endor was kind of boring. The end of the movie is fantastic. Like, the last third of the movie is really, really good. But the rest of it just wasn't that interesting to me. Again, it's not bad. I did like it, and, you know, the characters were done well, the dialogue was good, and the action was good and everything, but I just couldn't get into it the way I could get into the other 2 original movies and the last third or so of Return of the Jedi. So unfortunately it sits at number 6, and I do enjoy this movie, but honestly, I just can't get into it like some people can. Next up, at number 5, we have The Force Awakens. So The Force Awakens is a movie that's hard for me to place because it's moved around an awful lot whenever I've talked about my rankings for the movies with other people. And it's also kind of hard for me because of like nostalgia, even though it came out less than 2 years ago. It was the first Star Wars movie that I, actually got excited for, because I was a kid when Revenge of the Sith came out, but I was nowhere near as excited for Revenge of the Sith as I was The Force Awakens, because I was a lot younger, I wasn't as into Star Wars as I am now. But then also, the premiere and everything was a really fun experience, so I am a little bit biased towards it because of those reasons. I do try, when I talk about it, to be a little more objective while still having the things that I did enjoy about it and talking about those. But I try to keep my thoughts about the actual experience leading up to and including the release of The Force Awakens kind of out of the conversation. One of the biggest complaints about this movie is that it's very, very similar to the original Star Wars movie, A New Hope. And I can definitely see that argument. At first, when I first watched it, I hardly noticed any of the similarities, probably just because I was super excited and was just kind of taking everything all in. But when I watched it again, I did notice a lot more similarities, and of course, looking through the internet and everything, I did see people talking about the similarities, and so I was aware of them by then. However, looking at it on its own and taking the similarities to A New Hope out, it is a pretty decent movie. It's got good characters, it's got good action, it's got a pretty decent storyline, the effects are done very well. One thing I really liked is how they blended together practical effects and CGI, which I think worked really, really well. So overall, The Force Awakens is good on its own, but unfortunately is held back by how similar it is to the original movies, so it goes to number 5. Number 4 is Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Without a doubt, Revenge of the Sith is the best out of the 3 prequel films, for several reasons as well. The acting overall is better, although not all of it is better. There is a considerable amount of more good acting in Revenge of the Sith than there is in Phantom Menace or Attack of the Clones. And the effects are also done a little better, even though there is still a whole lot of CGI. It is done a little bit better than it was in the other 2 films. The story is also pretty interesting, and the characters, while Anakin's transition to the dark side is done quite abruptly, besides that, the story is pretty good. The lightsaber fight at the end is also fairly good for the most part. It is a little bit too long and a little too over the top. I actually found myself getting bored about halfway through it, which is not something you want when you're supposed to be showing off a whole bunch of spectacle and everything. And the same thing goes for the fight between Yoda and Darth Sidious. It's really a fight that I don't think we needed to see, although I did enjoy the parts where they used the Force and everything, because just moving big objects around with the Force is always cool. That was kind of unnecessary and also went on a little long, although the Anakin and Obi-Wan fight was definitely worse in the sense that it went on too long. However, the end of the lightsaber duel between Anakin and Obi-Wan was very well done, where Anakin is down by the lava and Obi-Wan is talking to him. That was, in my opinion, one of the best scenes in Star Wars ever. And overall, this movie connects the 2 trilogies pretty well. I think that's one of the strongest points about it, as well as some of the characters being done pretty decently. Overall, it's not super fantastically amazing, but it is definitely the best out of the prequel films, and not really that bad of a movie in general. And so it gets number 4. Now, number 3 and number 2, in my opinion, are almost interchangeable, but I had to come up with an order, so I put this one at number 3, and it is the most recent Star Wars film as of this recording, and that is Rogue One. I was surprised by how much I really enjoyed Rogue One, because I wasn't expecting to enjoy a spin-off film as much as I did, even though I was very excited for it. It actually really surprised me in how good a pretty good chunk of it was. It is probably the best film since the original trilogy. The story is well done, the characters are pretty well done, even though they don't have a whole lot of development, what they're given is pretty good. The characters are also pretty well written and well acted. They definitely did a good job getting writers and actors for this movie. In particular, the characters of Chirrut and K2SO, as well as director Krennic. Those are all written very well and acted very well, and in my opinion are the three best characters in this movie. Unfortunately, though, not everything about Rogue One is great. The beginning is a little bit slow and a little bit choppy, and I actually found myself a little bit bored during it. It was still interesting at points with the character development, especially of Cassian in the short scene that he was in during the beginning. But up until where they first go to Jeddah, it's really not super interesting and edited quite poorly, because it is kind of choppy and jarring to be jumping to so many different places all at once. However, after you get past that, the movie is fantastic. The third act, where they're on Scarif, is really, really well done. Very tense and exciting. I really enjoy how they took some risks with it as well, because Rogue One overall is just kind of a giant risk because it's a completely different Star Wars movie from what we've seen before. But at the end, every single main character, including the main villain, gets killed, which is very different from anything we've seen in Star Wars before, and I really appreciate that they did that. I was kinda surprised by it because, knowing Disney and Lucasfilm, they like their franchises and they like being able to make money, and killing off these characters means not having them in other movies, which means no toys and no merchandise based on them. At least not as much as they would have if they were in other movies. So even though Rogue One is not a perfect film by any standards, it is still the best Star Wars film since the original trilogy, and is still a very enjoyable film on its own, and so it gets the number 3 spot. So now we come to the second best Star Wars movie of all time, in my opinion, and like I said, this could almost be interchangeable with Rogue One. However, I'm giving this one the edge because it's the movie that started it all, which means it's Episode 4, A New Hope. I'm actually very surprised by how well this movie still holds up, because even though some of the effects are showing their age, and some of the dubbing for like the dialogue, if you listen closely, has some background noise and static in it, and at times the acting and the dialogue is not great, it still surprisingly holds up for the most part pretty well. And not only that, but it had a huge impact on not only the movie industry, but the world really in its entirety. It changed pop culture, and it changed the lives of millions of people, including myself, and really introduced us to a world that tons of people would fall in love with over 40 years now. But putting all of that to the side, it still has a good story and good characters, really good music as well. John Williams really did a good job with the score for this movie, and with the other Star Wars movies as well, but of course this is the one that started it all. It has the iconic theme, and it also has 2 of my favorite Star Wars songs ever, being The Binary Sunset and The Throne Room. Overall, it's just a really enjoyable movie, and you cannot deny the huge impact that this movie had on the entire world, not just the movie industry, but the world as a whole and the lives of many, many people. Now, you probably knew what number 1 was gonna be when you started watching this video, and that is Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. I don't even think this is gonna be a surprise to really anyone, because not only is The Empire Strikes Back a very, very good sequel to a very, very good movie in the first place, but also one of the best sequels and one of the best films of all time. The characters are vastly improved, even though they were still good in the prior film. They are given a whole lot more characterization and done very, very well. The story is also done very well. It's a really interesting story. The acting was also improved, even though it was not terrible in A New Hope. It definitely left a little bit of something to be desired, and they definitely improved on it in Empire Strikes Back. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the huge plot twist that pretty much blew everybody away. Even people who have never seen The Empire Strikes Back or even any Star Wars movie know about the plot twist. And it's just, no other movie has really done something like that, where one scene has become such a vital part of pop culture and film history that pretty much everybody knows it, even if they haven't seen the movie. So overall, The Empire Strikes Back is not only a great sequel and a great film on its own, but one of the best of all time. So it definitely deserves the #1 spot of the greatest Star Wars film of all time. So that brings this video to an end. Tell me in the comments below, what did you think of the list? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Do you think that some of the movies that I had lower on the list were actually better than what they were? Or do you actually think that some of the movies that were higher were actually worse than what I have them? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on the list. So anyways, thank y'all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel for more Star Wars videos. And as always, I'll see you next time, and may the Force be with you always.